Back in the 1960s, a man who terrorized women and burgled homes in Boston, New York, was sentenced to life in prison, but not for the infamous murders associated with him. He's known as the Boston Strangler. However, even to this very day, there are many criminal profilers, even among the FBI, plus psychiatrists, psychologists and lawyers, who question whether he really committed those crimes. Some avidly believe he did, whereas others believe he didn't. Or maybe he committed one or two of the murders.
I think he did some of them, but I think there were some copycats, and I think a man named George Nassar, who was Albert's cellmate, might have done a couple of them too. Some of the attorneys always thought that.
Hi my friend, I'm Royston, and welcome back to Tea and Crime. Today we're going to explore the truth about Albert Desalvo, starting with his early life, plus the crimes he was sentenced for. But who was this man, and what kind of personality did he have? When did he become active as a criminal? But more importantly, was he really a serial killer? Maybe his profile will help shed some light on that. Now, even though he was associated with the Boston Strangler murders, he was never convicted for them. One of the concerns was this: his criminal profile didn't seem to match up with that of a killer. But 50 years after the event, new evidence became available, making an impact on numerous individuals. But what about you? Where do you stand on this? Was he the killer? Or was it perhaps more complicated than that? All of this is being considered, and I'd like to invite you to grab yourselves a cup of tea before we deep dive into it. Albert Desalvo was born in Chelsea, Massachusetts on the 3rd of September 1931. His father, who was named Frank, was an alcoholic who expressed overwhelming aggression toward his family, frequently beating each and every one of them. On one occasion, he knocked out the teeth of his wife Charlotte and bent her fingers back one by one until they broke as she lay unconscious. He did this while Albert and the rest of his children were watching. He also had the habit of bringing prostitutes home, carrying out sexual activities with them in front of his wife and children. When he wasn't doing that, he tutored Albert in the art of breaking and entering homes, while the young boy was only 5 or 6 years old. The effect this had on the lad became apparent when he immersed himself in criminal activities at a very young age, such as shoplifting and torturing animals. Torturing animals is a behaviour affiliated with psychopathy. It often starts in childhood as a result of an abusive, chaotic or neglectful home environment. Clearly, young Albert Desalvo experienced that kind of environment. Just after turning 12, he was arrested for robbery and battery. The following month, he was sent to the Lyman School for Boys, which is currently an abandoned building and desolate after it closed down in 1971. At the time, it served an important role for young people with behavioural problems by attempting to help them find a more productive path in life. However, the place was notorious for its brutality. After spending 10 months there, he was released, after which he found employment making deliveries. He returned to the facility though in 1946 for stealing a motor vehicle. Once his time came to an end, he enlisted in the army at the age of 17 but was honourably discharged after his first tour of duty for disobeying orders. Albert then re-enlisted in the army and was stationed in Germany for several years, where he met a woman named Irmgard Beck, who he married there in 1953, when he was around age 22, something like that. His wife returned with him to the US in 1954-55, but it wasn't long before he found himself in trouble with the law again. What happened was, he posed as a rent collector, entering the home where a 9-year-old girl lived, who he apparently violated, or at least was accused of that. And as a consequence, he was charged with gross misconduct against a child, pleading not guilty to the offence. Fortunately for him, the girl's mother didn't want her daughter to testify due to potential embarrassment while having to relive the trauma. Therefore, the case was dismissed. Desalvo was then honourably discharged from the army a second time in 1956 and settled down with his wife in the Boston area. Their first child was a girl named Judy, who was born around that time, who sadly had a physical disability in the form of a congenital pelvic disease. Now, this disability had a large impact on the Desalvos. His wife was terrified of having another child with some kind of an impairment, doing everything she could to actively avoid having sex. However, that posed a serious issue, as Desalvo himself had an abnormal, voracious sexual appetite, requiring it several times a day. Although his wife avoided bedtime activities as much as possible, they did manage to produce a son without a disability, named Michael in 1960. But leading up to that, between 1956 and 1960, when Michael was born, Albert was arrested several times for the behaviour his father taught him of breaking and entering. Each time, he received a suspended sentence, so he was quite lucky. Yet during this period filled with legal issues, he somehow managed to maintain steady employment, working as a press operator as well as a construction worker. He was described by fellow employees as a decent family man and a good grafter, being liked by a lot of people. But one of his personality traits was to brag, which was a symbol of his insecurities. I don't think he believed others would accept him for simply being Albert. His mindset was geared toward telling sensational stories in order to feel accepted. He built a reputation for doing that, for bragging. One of the stories he told to females was he represented a modelling agency as a talent scout, and his name was Johnson. He was in his late 20s at this point, coming across, silky smooth with his talk, informing them they could find modelling work through him, providing they had the credentials. However, in order to gauge whether they had what it took, he needed to take their measurements. Unbelievably, many of the women fell for this, allowing him to enter their apartment to do that. He found these women by going from house to house knocking on doors, and with his measuring tape, he'd go to work on them, but his main goal was to indecently fondle the women, propositioning them for sex. Several of them were so appalled they contacted the authorities, and he became known as the Measuring Man. However, his stint as a measuring man came to an end in March 1960 when he was arrested for breaking into a house. He confessed to the burglary, and without any prompting, he additionally confessed to being the Measuring Man, bragging about his pursuits. A sentence of 18 months in prison followed, but he was released after 11 of them for good behaviour. Incredibly, after being released, he embarks on a new crime spree throughout Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island and New Hampshire. Now, during this phase, he always dressed in green, as he broke into hundreds of houses, posing as a workman of some kind. The real objective was to enter those homes, tie up and violently assault women. Some sources say it was in the hundreds, whereas others specify it was as many as 1,000 or more who became his victims. Then in June 1962, the first of the Boston Strangler victims was murdered. The Boston Strangler is credited with killing 13 women between June 62 and January 64. Those who were unfortunate enough to be paid a visit by this man were violated in their own home before being strangled to death with articles of clothing. There was no evidence of forced entry into the apartments, as the killer posed as a maintenance worker, manipulating his way in. The women were aged between 19 and 85. However, 26-year-old Beverly Sammons was stabbed to death as opposed to being strangled, although she was found with scarves and a stocking tied around her neck, while 85-year-old Mary Mullen appeared to have literally had a heart attack during her assault. Interestingly, after the first 4 murders, a female reporter named Loretta McLaughlin was captivated by what was happening, but at the time the authorities hadn't linked the slayings. In fact, they had no interest in them. In the meantime, Loretta partnered up with another female reporter named Jean Cole, convincing her bosses that these murders must have been the work of one man, sharing details revealing a connection such as the fact the women were sexually violated in their homes and strangled with articles of clothing. In 1962, editors at the Boston Record, the forebearer to the Boston Herald, gave them the go-ahead to write a 4-part series covering the murders. The two reporters faced a minefield of sexism, as this was the 1960s. They were working in a man's world, and as soon as they got the nod to investigate the crimes, they threw everything they had into it. It was these two women who came up with a nickname that everyone became acquainted with, as they called the killer the Boston Strangler. Other nicknames associated with this monster, like the Phantom Strangler or the Mad Strangler, became insignificant. Their work was met with a storm of skepticism from authorities, who were frustrated at the level of detail in their stories. The police repeatedly rejected the suggestion that only one man was responsible, even though up to that point all the victims lived alone and were left with the killer's macabre calling card, a ligature tied around their neck in a decorative way, and not forgetting each victim was forcefully assaulted. However, while police throughout New England were searching for the notorious Green Man, Boston homicide detectives were unsure who they were looking for. Some detectives started to align their understanding of the killer with that of the two female reporters, whereas others felt multiple murderers were involved and that the crimes were unlinked. In the meantime, women in Boston made sure to lock their doors. They bought chains, deadbolts and pepper spray, plus much more. The authorities were inundated with calls from women who were terribly frightened, especially those who lived alone. Many of them moved in with friends or left Boston completely due to fear. The last murder took place in January 1964, and it coincided with the activities of the Green Man, who was exceptionally active at that time. In fact, on the 27th of October 1964, 9 months after the last murder, a young woman was sexually assaulted or attacked by the Green Man, yet the perpetrator apologised to her before leaving. She was able to describe her attacker to police, helping them produce a sketch of the man, explaining he told her that he was a detective. The police noticed similarities between him and another criminal who had a history of sexual deviance. It was Albert Desalvo. But to police, he was the infamous measuring man. A photo of Desalvo was published in the newspapers, which moved a lot of women to contact authorities explaining that he was the man who assaulted them. Not long after this, Albert was arrested and charged with multiple sexual offences, although the precise number is unknown. He was sent to the Bridgewater State Hospital for psychiatric observation, where he befriended convicted murderer George Nassar. It was reported by other convicts and a number of officers within the facility that Albert spent a lot of time with Nassar. They were always together, talking privately out of earshot from others, raising the theory that George was actually tutoring Desalvo regarding the details of the Boston murders. Then one day in 1965, Nassar called his lawyer, the famous F. Lee Bailey, to ask him a question. The question was, could the Boston Strangler make some money by publishing his story? Bailey was intrigued, and shortly after this he was introduced to Desalvo. Up to this point, Albert wasn't even on the radar concerning the Boston Strangler murders, yet he allegedly confessed these crimes initially to his mate Nassar, a manipulative, convicted murderer. Desalvo subsequently confessed to Mr. Bailey and gave his account to psychiatrists, a state investigator, and the Boston police, but he was never charged with any of the killings due to a lack of evidence. All of the people he spoke to, he did nothing but brag about his accomplishments as the Strangler, but he often got details of the crimes completely wrong, such as the time of death. He explained he strangled Sullivan, the last victim, with his bare hands, yet it was proven she was strangled by ligature, especially as Sullivan's hyoid and neck bone wasn't broken, which it should have been if strangled manually. He also claimed to have left a knife and a sweater at the murder scene, but none was ever found. However, they did find a Happy New Year card jammed between her toes. Later on, he retracted his confession of being a strangler, but the question is, why did he make that confession to begin with? It's believed he confessed in order to gain notoriety as well as money that could be used to take care of his family and treatment at a psychiatric hospital rather than spending his life in prison. See, Albert was hoping the case would make him famous. It's speculated that Desalvo and Nassar worked out a deal to split any reward money as a result, especially as Nassar was the one pulling the strings behind this manoeuvre. F. Lee Bailey represented Desalvo and negotiated a plea bargain which removed the possibility of the death penalty. Instead, Albert was sentenced to life in prison, something he didn't want, as he was expecting life in a mental institution as promised by Bailey apparently, but he was sentenced to life in prison for the Green Man assaults, which had nothing to do with the Boston Strangler. However, a psychiatrist, Dr. Ames Roby, who treated Albert and Nassar at Bridgewater, believed Desalvo was innocent regarding the stranglings. He said Desalvo was a very clever, very smooth compulsive confessor who desperately needed to be recognised. But his lawyer, however, F. Lee Bailey, believed he was guilty. Despite the fact that he may or may not have done it, Desalvo was able to describe each crime in detail, convincing Bailey of his guilt. Opposing him were the many detectives and prosecutors who believed Albert faked his confession. During his trial for the Green Man crimes in '67, Bailey said Desalvo was consumed by one of the most crushing sexual drives that psychiatric science has ever encountered. Then, after being sentenced to life in prison, he was sent to Walpole, reuniting with his old pal, Nassar, who was also there. It was a maximum security prison, where 6 years later in '73 the prison failed him, as someone managed to get through 6 sets of security checks, make their way to his cell, to stab him repeatedly in the heart. This chillingly happened directly after Albert made a phone call to Dr. Ames Roby, informing him he had something big to get off his chest. The psychiatrist believed Albert was about to share the truth about the real identity of the Strangler. But the next day, as Roby was getting ready to go to the prison, the news came on the radio. Desalvo was dead. So far we've looked at his awful childhood and some of the crimes he was sentenced for, like the Measuring Man and the Green Man convictions. I think it's time to explore whether his profile fit that of a serial killer. One thing that was noticed by criminal profilers was this. The murders attributed to the Boston Strangler have similarities, but there were some differences between them as well. Some victims were posed, some were not. Some murders were brutal and aggressive, while others were more clinical and efficient. Some victims were physically violated or raped, whereas others were assaulted with objects found in the house. Most of them were strangled with articles of clothing, yet one was strangled manually. Plus, 2 of them were stabbed to death. And Albert was rather unusual as a killer, due to the fact he confessed to crimes for which he wasn't arrested for, like in the case of the Measuring Man. And he admitted he was also the Green Man. And there was no evidence tying him to the Boston Stranglings, but it didn't stop him confessing to them. Occasionally he felt bad about his behaviour, like the time he apologised for assaulting the young woman in '64 before running off. On another occasion he placed a knife on the victim's throat, but caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, causing him to stop what he was doing because he didn't like what he saw. So he apologised to her as well, and then left very quickly. Serial killers are rarely comfortable with themselves initially, but over time they come to accept who they are. Albert didn't seem to reach that point, and on top of that his victim choice was unusual. He didn't target women based on physical appearance like a certain age group, height, weight, hair colour or whatever like many killers do. His victims were all shapes and sizes, from different ethnicities, while being aged between 19 and 85. Then we have the theory many believe, that the police were so desperate they fed him information. They were under pressure to catch someone, as the government were looking for a political victory to restore peace and safety within Boston. Several other very strong suspects were being investigated, who they abandoned when Albert confessed. But his confession came without any physical evidence tying him to any of the crimes. FBI profiler and criminologist Robert Resler believed more than one person committed the 13 murders, as there were too many different patterns and behaviours to suggest only one perpetrator. Furthermore, serial killers generally escalate from small crimes to more serious ones like assault, then eventually to homicide. They rarely go backward in the severity of the crimes, yet Albert was molesting women sexually without killing them well after the murders stopped. His profile doesn't seem to align with that of a typical serial killer. And let's not forget about George Nassar, who some believe conspired with Albert and could be the real Strangler. Nassar was actually a very good suspect. He hated women, he was considered psychopathic and was extremely intelligent, highly capable of manipulating Albert. The surviving victim of the Strangler was actually brought into the prison to identify her attacker. Between Desalvo and Nassar, she pointed out that Albert wasn't the guy. But when she saw George Nassar, she felt upset. There was something frightfully familiar about him. Could he have been the one who attempted to end her life? We know Albert's life ended in '73 when he was stabbed to death in Walpole Prison. It's believed an inmate was responsible, but whoever it was got away without ever being caught, which doesn't make sense, especially as 6 sets of security had to be overcome to get to him. It appears Albert's death was truly mysterious. But when Albert was alive, did he actually kill anyone? The best piece of evidence connecting Desalvo to the murders has to be DNA. In 2001, forensic analysis of the exhumed body of Mary Sullivan, the last victim of the Strangler, found that DNA taken from her underwear and pubic hair belonged neither to her or Desalvo, basically clearing him of that murder. But 12 years later, in June 2013, it was announced newly discovered DNA evidence linked Desalvo to her murder after all. His body was exhumed for DNA analysis, which proved, according to investigators, that he had in fact raped and murdered 19-year-old Sullivan. This caused authorities to suggest he was more than likely the killer of the other women, even though that DNA evidence has been disputed. I'd love to hear your views on this, whether or not you think Desalvo was the killer. The cases of the other 12 victims remains a mystery, as there was no DNA found at their crime scenes. Therefore, the Boston Strangler files remain open to this very day, with the killings officially listed as being unsolved. If, however, Desalvo was the Boston Strangler, he certainly didn't fit the profile of a typical serial killer, as many people originally thought. Well, I'm Royston. Thanks for watching.